If you've been on a spiritual path for months or years, doing all the practices, the meditation, the affirmations, the energy work, the gratitude journaling, and suddenly it all stopped working, you're not failing, you're not regressing, and you haven't lost your connection to the divine. What's happening is far more important than any of that. You've reached what Carl Jung called the collision point, the moment when spiritual bypassing collapses and real transformation becomes unavoidable. You've probably noticed the signs. The meditation that used to bring peace now brings anxiety. The affirmations that once felt powerful now feel hollow, like you're lying to yourself. The spiritual content you consumed obsessively suddenly irritates you. You can't force positivity anymore. You can't pray away the darkness. You can't manifest your way out of this feeling. And the worst part, you feel more lost now than you did before you started any spiritual practice at all. Here's what nobody in the spiritual community wants to tell you. This collapse is not a problem. It's the point. Jung discovered that most spiritual seeking is actually sophisticated avoidance. We use light to hide from darkness. We use transcendence to escape integration. We use spiritual concepts to bypass the psychological work that true transformation requires. And at some point, if you go deep enough, the psyche forces a reckoning. The practices stop working not because you're doing them wrong, but because they were never designed to take you where you actually need to go. This is the dark night Jung documented across hundreds of cases, and he found something disturbing. It happens most intensely to people who are genuinely committed to spiritual growth, not the casual practitioners, but the serious seekers, the ones who meditate daily, who've read all the books, who've invested years in their awakening. Because the more sophisticated your spiritual bypassing becomes, the more catastrophic its collapse must be to break through your defenses. Stay with me, because understanding what Jung discovered about this process will explain why your spiritual crisis is actually your spiritual breakthrough. In 1913, Carl Jung was at the height of his spiritual and intellectual development. He had studied world religions, mysticism, alchemy, and Eastern philosophy. He had developed theories about the collective unconscious and archetypes. He considered himself spiritually evolved, psychologically mature, and intellectually superior to most of his colleagues. And then his entire structure collapsed in a way that terrified him more than anything he'd experienced. After his break with Freud, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. But this wasn't a gentle spiritual awakening. This was psychological descent into territories that shattered every spiritual concept he'd built his identity around. He began experiencing visions that horrified him. Dark, violent, sexual imagery, encounters with inner figures that represented aspects of himself he'd spent years spiritually bypassing. Jung had believed, like many spiritual seekers, that enlightenment meant transcending the darkness, rising above the shadow, becoming pure consciousness untainted by lower human drives. He meditated, he studied sacred texts, he practiced what he believed was spiritual discipline. But when the unconscious erupted, it brought everything he'd been avoiding through his spiritual practice. He wrote in his private journals, later published in the Red Book, "I had to abandon the idea that I was master of my own house. I realized that much of what I called my spiritual development was actually my ego's attempt to remain in control while appearing to surrender. I was using the divine to avoid the human. I was using light to deny shadow. And the psyche would not allow this deception to continue." For 6 years, Jung descended. Not into hell in the religious sense, but into his own unconscious in the psychological sense. He encountered his capacity for cruelty, rage, and destruction. He faced his grandiosity, his inflation, his belief that he was special and chosen. He met parts of himself that contradicted every spiritual identity he'd constructed. The loving, evolved spiritual seeker had to confront the violent, petty, terrified human beneath the performance. This was Jung's dark night, and it was darker precisely because he had climbed so high spiritually. He had farther to fall. His colleagues thought he was having a psychotic break. His wife worried he would never recover. But Jung was discovering something revolutionary. The dark night isn't spiritual failure. It's spiritual initiation, the real one. Not the kind you read about in books or hear about from teachers, but the kind that destroys every concept of yourself you've been using to avoid yourself. Jung emerged from this period with a completely different understanding of transformation. He wrote, "The spiritual path does not lead upward away from the darkness. It leads downward into it, not to be consumed, but to integrate, not to transcend, but to include. The person who has only known light has not yet truly awakened. Awakening begins when the light you've been standing in reveals itself as another form of hiding." Let me show you exactly what happens during the dark night Jung mapped, and why spiritual people experience it most intensely. This process unfolds in 5 distinct stages, and each one reveals why your spiritual practices had to stop working for real transformation to begin. Stage 1. The spiritual inflation phase. Before the dark night, there's what Jung called spiritual inflation. This is when you genuinely believe you're more evolved than others because of your spiritual practices. You don't necessarily say it out loud, but you feel it. You see people caught in drama and think, "I'm beyond that now." You witness suffering and believe you've transcended it through your practices. You encounter darkness in others and feel grateful you've done the work to rise above such lower vibrations. Jung identified this as the ego masquerading as the soul. The small self uses spiritual concepts to reinforce its sense of superiority rather than dissolving into genuine humility. You're not becoming enlightened. You're becoming spiritually arrogant, but it feels like growth because you're calmer, more positive, more high vibe than before. Here's what's actually happening psychologically. You're using spiritual practice as a defense mechanism. Meditation becomes a way to suppress uncomfortable emotions rather than process them. Affirmations become a way to deny reality rather than transform your relationship with it. Gratitude journaling becomes toxic positivity that invalidates genuine pain. You're not integrating your shadow. You're painting it white and calling it light. A woman named Maya described this phase perfectly in a Jung study group. She said, "I spent 3 years in what I thought was spiritual awakening. I meditated for hours. I only consumed positive content. I surrounded myself with other spiritual people, and I genuinely believed I was evolving. But looking back, I was just becoming really good at avoiding anything that made me uncomfortable. I called it boundaries. I called it protecting my energy. Jung would call it sophisticated denial. The spiritual inflation phase feels good because you have all the answers. You know what's wrong with other people. You can diagnose their consciousness level. You can explain why they're suffering and why you're not. This sense of knowing creates a false stability that must eventually collapse. Stage 2. The collapse of spiritual defenses. The dark night begins when your spiritual defenses stop working. Not gradually, but suddenly. Like a structure that's been weakening invisibly, finally gives way all at once. You sit down to meditate, and instead of peace, you feel overwhelming anxiety. You write your affirmations and they sound absurd, like lies you're telling yourself. You try to stay positive and you can't. The darkness you've been managing with spiritual practice erupts anyway. Jung described this as the return of the repressed. Everything you used spirituality to avoid comes flooding back, but now it's stronger because you've been compressing it for so long. The anger you transformed into loving kindness erupts as rage. The grief you transcended through acceptance crashes back as overwhelming sadness. The fear you dissolved through faith paralyzes you. What makes this stage devastating for spiritual people is the sense of failure. You did everything right. You were disciplined. You were committed. You followed the teachings. And now you're worse off than before you started. You see people who never did any spiritual work handling life better than you are. This creates a crisis of meaning. If the practices don't work, What was the point of any of it? Dr. James Hollis, a Jungian analyst, explained this phenomenon. Spiritual seekers often come to therapy in crisis, convinced they've regressed, but what's actually happening is progression. Their psyche has determined they're strong enough now to face what the spiritual practice was helping them avoid. The collapse is not failure, it's readiness. During this stage, you might abandon your practices entirely, or you might desperately intensify them, trying to force them to work again. Neither approach succeeds because the issue isn't your technique. The issue is that your psyche is demanding a different kind of work now. Not transcendence, but integration. Not rising above, but going below. Stage 3. The shadow encounter for spiritual people. This is where the dark night becomes truly dark. You're forced to encounter the shadow aspects of yourself that your spiritual practice was specifically designed to help you avoid. And for spiritual people, this is uniquely painful because the shadow often contains everything that contradicts your spiritual identity. You discover you're capable of pettiness despite all your loving kindness meditation. You feel intense jealousy despite your abundance mindset. You experience schadenfreude, taking pleasure in others' failures despite your compassion practices. You notice you judge people harshly while preaching non-judgment. You catch yourself being manipulative while teaching authenticity. You realize you use your spiritual knowledge to feel superior, to control others, to avoid intimacy, to bypass accountability. Jung found that spiritual seekers often have the darkest shadows because they've been the most aggressive in rejecting certain human qualities. If you've spent years affirming, "I am love," you've likely repressed your capacity for hatred. If you've practiced, "Everything happens for a reason," you've likely denied your anger at life's injustice. If you've embodied high vibration, you've likely disowned your depression, your despair, your very human need to sometimes fall apart. The shadow encounter during the dark night is brutal because it dismantles your spiritual self-concept. You can't maintain the identity of conscious or awakened or evolved while simultaneously acknowledging that you're petty, judgmental, manipulative, and cruel. This creates what Jung called cognitive dissonance so intense it threatens ego dissolution. A spiritual teacher named David, who went through this process publicly, shared, "I had a thriving YouTube channel teaching mindfulness and presence. Then I entered my dark night and discovered I was using teaching as a way to avoid practicing. I was using my role as guru to maintain narcissistic supply. I was spiritually bypassing my childhood trauma, my relationship problems, my addiction patterns. I had to either face this and lose my spiritual identity, or deny it and remain stuck. I chose to face it. I lost most of my followers, but I found something more real than anything I'd been teaching." Stage 4. The necessary disillusionment. This stage is what separates those who will integrate from those who will return to spiritual bypassing. Disillusionment means losing your illusions, and for spiritual people, the illusions run deep. You must become disillusioned with the spiritual path itself as you understood it, with the teachers you idealized, with the practices you believed would save you, with the entire framework of spiritual growth that your ego was using to remain in control while appearing to surrender. Jung called this the death of God in the psychological sense. Not that divinity doesn't exist, but that your concept of it was serving your ego's needs rather than your soul's evolution. The loving universe you believed in must be questioned. The idea that you're exactly where you're supposed to be must be challenged. The notion that everything is perfect must be dismantled. This stage feels like losing your faith, and in a sense you are. But what you're losing is false faith, the kind that protected you from reality rather than helping you engage with it. True faith, Jung believed, emerges on the other side of disillusionment. But you cannot skip the disillusionment. You cannot go around it. You must go through it. During this phase, spiritual people often experience what looks like spiritual nihilism. Nothing means anything. Your past experiences of transcendence feel like delusion. Your mystical moments feel like brain chemistry. Your sense of connection to something larger collapses into feeling utterly alone. This is excruciating for people who built their entire identity around spiritual connection. But Jung discovered something profound here. This disillusionment is necessary because it destroys the false spiritual self, the one who was seeking enlightenment to escape being human, the one who was using consciousness to feel superior, the one who was practicing presence to avoid dealing with the past. That self must die, and its death feels like your death if you've been identified with it. A Jungian analyst named Marion Woodman wrote, "The dark night is God's way of freeing us from a God that's too small. We must lose the deity we created in our own image so we can encounter what's actually divine rather than what our ego found comforting." Stage 5. The integration point. If you stay with the process, if you don't run back to spiritual bypassing or collapse into despair, you reach what Jung called the integration point. This is not a return to where you were before. It's not the restoration of your old spiritual highs. It's something entirely different. It's the marriage of spirit and shadow, light and dark, transcendence and embodiment. Integration means you no longer use spirituality to escape your humanity. You use consciousness to engage with it more fully. You meditate not to rise above difficult emotions, but to be with them more completely. You practice presence not to avoid the past, but to process it consciously. You cultivate awareness not to transcend the body, but to inhabit it more deeply. Jung described this as the union of opposites. You hold both the spiritual and the psychological, the divine and the human, the light and the shadow, without needing to resolve them into false simplicity. You become paradoxical. You're awake and still struggling. You're conscious and still learning. You're evolved and still messy. And you stop seeing this as a contradiction. You recognize it as wholeness. What emerges after the dark night is what Jung called the individuated self, not the ego pretending to be spiritual, not the persona performing enlightenment, but the whole person who has integrated both their transcendent nature and their wounded humanity. This person is actually humble, not performing humility, actually present, not performing presence, actually authentic, not performing authenticity. The practices may return, but they function differently now. You meditate, but you're not meditating to feel good or to prove you're spiritual. You're meditating because consciousness itself is valuable, regardless of the experience it produces. You practice gratitude, but you're not using it to deny pain. You're acknowledging what's real, while also recognizing what's good. You engage with spiritual concepts, but you hold them lightly, knowing they're maps, not territory. One man, Marcus, who completed this journey, described it. "Before the dark night, I was spiritual in a way that made me feel special. After the dark night, I'm spiritual in a way that makes me feel human. The difference is everything. I'm not trying to transcend life anymore. I'm trying to be fully alive in it. And that includes the darkness, the doubt, the messiness. That's not falling from grace. That's what grace actually feels like when you stop performing it." Here's the truth that the spiritual community desperately needs to hear, but constantly avoids. The dark night happens most intensely to spiritual people because spiritual practice, when misused, creates the most sophisticated form of psychological defense. And the more sophisticated your defense, the more catastrophic its collapse must be. Jung observed that many spiritual seekers come to the path not from genuine calling, but from psychological wounding they haven't processed. Childhood trauma, attachment injuries, identity confusion, existential anxiety. These wounds are real, and they need real healing. But instead of doing the psychological work of processing trauma, integrating shadow, and building a stable self, many people bypass directly to spiritual practice. They meditate away their anxiety rather than understanding its source. They affirm away their shame rather than healing its root. They transcend their anger rather than learning its message. This works temporarily. It manages symptoms. It creates the feeling of progress, but it doesn't create transformation because the wounded material remains unintegrated in the unconscious. The spiritual person develops what Jung called a persona of enlightenment. They look conscious, sound evolved, and genuinely believe they're awakened. But beneath the spiritual performance, the shadow grows. The unprocessed trauma festers, the denied emotions accumulate pressure, and eventually, the psyche can no longer maintain the split between the spiritual persona and the wounded reality. This is why the dark night is especially brutal for committed spiritual seekers. You have farther to fall because you climbed so high. You have more to lose because you invested so much. And you have less permission to struggle because your entire identity is built on having transcended struggle. Jung wrote something devastating in his private journals. The most dangerous patients are not those who ignore the spiritual life, but those who use it as a sophisticated escape from the psychological life. They are the hardest to reach because they have surrounded their wounds with walls of light that they genuinely believe represent healing. To help them, I must first shatter their spiritual defenses. This makes me appear to be attacking their awakening when I am actually initiating it. This doesn't mean spiritual practice is wrong. It means spiritual practice without psychological integration is incomplete at best and harmful at worst. You cannot transcend what you haven't integrated. You cannot be free of what you haven't faced. You cannot heal what you're still denying. So if you're in the dark night right now, if your spiritual practices have collapsed and you're facing the shadow you spent years avoiding, here's what Jung would want you to understand. This is not the end of your spiritual journey. This is where it actually begins. Everything up until now was preparation. The practices you learned, the concepts you studied, the experiences you had, all of that was building psychological muscles you need for this moment. You needed to develop some capacity for presence before you could be present with your shadow. You needed to cultivate some inner witness before you could witness your own darkness without being consumed by it. The spiritual bypassing phase, though incomplete, was not wasted. It was training. Now comes the real work. Not transcending the darkness, but integrating it. Not rising above your humanity, but inhabiting it fully. Not becoming more spiritual, but becoming more whole. This integration process looks different from traditional spiritual practice because it's not linear, not peaceful, and not predictable. You'll have days where you feel connected to something larger and days where you feel utterly alone. Both are real. You'll have moments of profound clarity and moments of complete confusion. Both are necessary. You'll experience yourself as divine consciousness and as wounded human. Both are true. Integration means holding these contradictions without needing to resolve them. Jung believed that the individuated person, the one who has completed the dark night journey, is recognizable not by their constant peace, but by their capacity for complexity. They're comfortable with ambiguity. They don't need to have all the answers. They can sit with not knowing. They can hold paradox. They're spiritual and skeptical, awake and still learning, evolved and still growing. Here's what your life looks like after integration. You're less certain about everything, but more grounded in yourself. You're less performatively positive, but more genuinely okay. You're less focused on appearing enlightened, but more actually present. The spiritual concepts that used to feel profound now feel simplistic, but you've gained access to something more real that doesn't need conceptual validation. You'll probably lose people during this process. The spiritual community that celebrated your light will be uncomfortable with your willingness to acknowledge your darkness. People who knew you as the spiritual one won't know what to do with your newfound humanity. Teachers who trained you in transcendence will view your integration work as regression. Let them go. Your path has diverged from theirs. One woman, Eleanor, 3 years past her dark night, told me, I lost my entire spiritual community. They wanted the version of me that was always positive, always inspired, always high vibe. When I started being honest about my depression, my anger, my doubts, they said I'd lost my light. But I didn't lose my light. I just stopped using it to hide my darkness. And the people who can handle both, those are my people now. If you're in the dark night right now, leave one word in the comments. Something like descending, or breaking, or integrating, or real. Whatever captures where you are. This isn't about performing your spiritual journey for others. It's about marking this moment for yourself. The dark night is not spiritual failure. It's spiritual initiation into something more real than anything you've experienced before. Jung spent 6 years in his confrontation with the unconscious, and he emerged as the person who would revolutionize depth psychology and create the roadmap for genuine transformation. Your dark night is doing the same work in your psyche. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring Jung's insights into shadow work, integration, and the journey beyond spiritual bypassing, because this is where the real conversation begins. Not in the light and love and positivity that sells so well on social media, but in the messy, complex, paradoxical reality of becoming a whole human being. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the spiritual version you're performing, not the enlightened persona you've constructed, but the complete, integrated, fully human person you are beneath all the bypassing. That person includes shadow and light, wounds and wisdom, darkness and divinity. And that person is more beautiful, more powerful, and more real than any spiritual ideal you've been trying to achieve. The dark night strips away everything that isn't essential. It's painful because you thought those things were you, but they weren't. They were defenses, performances, spiritual bypassing masquerading as growth. What remains after the night passes is what was always real, your essential self, flawed, human, divine, and finally whole. The spiritual community won't celebrate this. They want the light without the shadow. But Jung would recognize you. He'd see someone brave enough to face what most people spend their entire spiritual lives avoiding, and he'd tell you what I'm telling you now. You're not lost. You're exactly where you need to be. In the dark, learning to see. Welcome to the real path.